Hi everyone, it's Russell here from The Presenter. I hope you're well. A slightly longer video clip than normal today. Something that people have been requesting from me an awful lot is how do we avoid death by Prezi? And if you haven't seen Death by Prezi yet, then you will in a second on this YouTube clip. But essentially, Death by Prezi is the overuse of Prezi's zooming and panning around functionality. It's a very common mistake that people make with Prezi, is to think that that's what the software is all about, but I'm here to tell you otherwise. So this presentation is actually a keynote speech that I gave at Prezi Day 2013 in Amsterdam very recently. It had great feedback, and I'm sure you'll find some useful information from it as well. So what I want you to do is imagine for a second, and in fact imagine this for all of your presentations going forward, imagine that you are the pilot of a plane and your audience members are actually passengers. So let's pretend for a second I'm your pilot and you're my passenger. And what I'd like to do is just give you a really important safety briefing. Now hopefully we shouldn't have to do this at the start of every Prezi presentation, but at the moment with Death by Prezi it could be quite a necessary thing to do. So let's first of all look at what is Death by Prezi. Well, the danger is that, like I said a second ago, the moving, the panning around and the rotation that we can use in Prezi is what people think Prezi is all about. The zooming in on the details, the rotating things around clockwise or anti-clockwise, and people just tend to approach the software without really thinking about the safety of their passengers that they have on board, and they like to go absolutely crazy with this functionality because, you know, they've just got it wrong from the very start. They honestly believe that all of this movement and all of these spins and zooms that we see are going to help them tell their story. Well, hopefully you already agree with me that they're absolutely wrong. And as I try to make you feel quite sick right now by spinning and rotating this aeroplane image around all over the place, hopefully you're getting the message that I'm trying to conclude, and will conclude in just a second. And that's, of course, the only thing this is going to do is make people feel very sick. Okay, so death by PowerPoint normally puts people to sleep, but death by Prezi will actually make people feel physically sick. Motion sickness is a really common term that we hear whenever people talk about their experience with Prezi so far, and it's normally because they've had a very bad, very negative experience. Okay, but do not panic. If you follow the advice I'm about to give you, then every flight that you and your passengers take with Prezi should be a very, very smooth one. So let's take a look first of all at why this happens. I think it's really important to address that. Well, it's quite simple really. It's for some of the reasons I mentioned a second ago. But let's take the example again that a presenter who first discovers Prezi is a little bit like a pilot who has always dreamt of flying a plane. Okay, so growing up, those pilots may have dreamt of getting behind the wheel, or the joystick I should say, of their aeroplane and then performing all sorts of ridiculous aerial maneuvers because, hey, that looks like fun, doesn't it? But of course the reality of that is very, very different. And in fact, the reality can be an extremely scary one. So don't be fooled the very first time you see Prezi into thinking that the spinning, the zooming around is what Prezi's about, because actually it's a nice part of the system and it's nice to use that very sparingly to help make your point or to engage the audience. But what we don't want to do is give the audience the kind of experience that we're seeing on the screen right now. That's just not good at all. So we really need to stop and think before we start building our Prezi designs. And of course, if we do end up delivering one of those experiences, then we have to face the consequences as well. So if someone does decide to fly with us on Prezi Airways as a member of the audience, and we deliver death by Prezi, then the chances are that we're going to injure quite a lot of people, and they're probably going to sue our asses. First of all, we will definitely make people feel sick, though. That's one of the main things that people talk about when they have a bad experience with Prezi. They're definitely only going to remember us for a bad experience. Now, obviously, we don't want to deliver a presentation and have people talk about it in a negative way afterwards at all, whether it's Keynote, PowerPoint or Prezi. So this is something we really, really need to avoid. And also, people probably aren't going to want to fly with Prezi again once they have this very negative death by Prezi experience. So we want to try and avoid that from happening as well, because the chances are that they will then go back to flying in very old-fashioned ways. So just like the Wright brothers did all those many years ago, very, very old-fashioned methods of flight, we do not want people to return back to those in terms of presenting, of course. We really cannot let that happen, and as one of the 29 million Prezi users right now, I feel obliged to deliver a really engaging, really memorable and really fun experience for my audiences when I use Prezi, because I'm so passionate about it. I can see its potential. I know the reasons why people should use it, so I need to avoid death by Prezi at all costs. And I'm going to show you how to do that, of course, right now. So it's actually quite simple. It's actually quite simple to do. It just requires a little bit of common sense and, of course, lots and lots of planning, which I talk about quite a lot through our presenter website in the hints and tips pages. So let's take a quick look then at how we can actually avoid death by Prezi. Well, the very first thing to point out, I suppose, is that the pilot of a plane would never ever wait until the morning of their flight to just jump on board and then ask the co-pilot, "Where are we going today?" And in turn, the co-pilot would never answer that question by saying, "I'm not sure, I thought you knew." If that happened, then the audience members, or I should say the passengers on that flight, are probably in for a very negative experience. The chances are they're not going to get to their destination in time. It's going to take a lot longer. And they might actually have quite a bumpy ride, because there'll be all sorts of twists and turns that the pilot might have to perform to figure out where he's going. Okay, so there's a really, really obvious point I'm trying to make here, and that is something really simple but gets overlooked an awful lot. And that's, what is your destination? So in terms of our presentation, I suppose what we should say is actually, what is your objective? What is the reason for your presentation, for your visuals? Why is it there, and how does it help you deliver your content? Okay, what is the objective? You must know that before you go anywhere near Prezi. Okay, now my objective for this presentation, when I delivered it at Prezi Day last week, my objectives were really clear, and I wrote these down on paper before I went anywhere near Prezi. The very first objective was to give the audience a demo of what death by Prezi is, and of course show them how it might look. The second objective was to help them realize why death by Prezi happens. So like I said a second ago, it's simply because people get so carried away with the movement and so excited by it, they think that that's what Prezi's all about. So don't get too excited. It is a nice part of the software, but overuse of it will create death by Prezi. Okay. My final objective was to explain how to plan a Prezi in the right way to avoid death by Prezi, and that's actually what I'm about to do right now. So my first two objectives I've already covered off in about 9 minutes, which is pretty good going. Okay, now I'm going to tell you how to avoid it completely. So we've talked about destinations a second ago, or objectives for your presentation, and we need to figure out what is the smoothest and most direct route to that objective. Okay, the less we can sort of twist and turn our way there, the better. The more direct route is always the best, it's always the shortest, and it's always going to get us there much, much quicker, which is a great thing for our audience. But how do we figure out that route? Well, I use a technique called mind mapping, which is an extremely popular technique for planning anything, in fact. But it's in particularly useful with Prezi because it's very similar to what you would actually do in the Prezi canvas. So I would strongly recommend you look into mind mapping and probably Google the creator of mind mapping, whose name is Tony Buzan. That's Buzan. There are some amazing books out there on mind mapping, how it can how it can help you plan any kind of aspect of your life or work. But I love using it for planning my prezis, and the reason is that I can take a piece of paper, grab a pen, write my objective or my destination in the middle of the page, and then branch out into all of the key facts that I need to cover in that presentation. Once I know what all of those key facts are, I can then branch out even further to look at the really kind of minute details that I might have to cover in each of those areas. And being able to see all of that on one page of A4 or A3 or A2, it's entirely up to you what size paper you use, but being able to see all of that on one canvas really helps me understand how I might transfer that presentation onto Prezi. Okay, so I strongly recommend you use that as a way to plan your presentations. So the very first rule of Prezi Flight School, and probably the most important one, is to plan your flight path and know your destination. If you don't know where you're going, then it's going to be a very bumpy ride for your audience. Okay? Now, just to show you very quickly, this is actually a mind map that I created for this presentation that you're viewing right now. So when I started with just a piece of paper and a pen, I had absolutely no idea that the theme of my presentation was going to be based on flight. Okay, that concept came from this mind map. And I'm just going to highlight some of the words here that enabled me to come up with that concept. So you can see we've got things like planning your journey, sick passengers, motion sickness, and also a little picture of an aeroplane that I drew when my brain started to come up with this theme of flight. And all of those things being on one sheet of paper in front of me really enabled my brain to come up with what we would call the big picture. Okay, now the big picture is extremely important in Prezi. It's the simplest way for you to really kind of glue all of the concepts of your presentation together into one big visual metaphor. Sometimes it's extremely easy to figure out what your big picture might be. Sometimes it might take a little bit more thought. It really depends on what your subject is. But without a doubt, it's much easier to figure out what your big picture is going to be if you mind map and plan with pen and paper before you go anywhere near Prezi. That's absolutely crucial. Now, my big picture, just to remind you, is this flight safety card that I showed you right at the very beginning of this presentation. This is my big picture, and this is where every single part of my presentation lives. Now, for me, this is fantastic, and this is another common mistake that I come across with new Prezi users, and that's that they don't contain everything in one space. They don't put up boundaries and limit themselves to the amount of movement that they're going to use in their Prezi design. Now, this is really important because, of course, in Prezi, if we wanted to, we could zoom all the way out and use an infinite amount of space. But there is a danger with that. There's too much space and there's too much freedom. Okay, I know you say too much freedom, that must, surely that's not a bad thing, but actually it can be. And I would say that if you spread your content out too far and wide, then you're going to give your audience death by Prezi, because moving from one area to the next will be such a big leap that it will not look good on screen. So I always try to contain everything within a big picture, and outside of that, even though I have this infinite space, I don't use it. And I would call that space the no-fly zone. Okay, again, flight related. And I strongly recommend that you try to avoid getting carried away and using all of that space. Okay, it's a really, really nice fact that it's there, but it doesn't have to be used. Okay, and in fact, I would look out, because there are some very dangerous characters in that no-fly zone that are just intent on shooting you down and ruining your presentation. And we definitely don't want that to happen. So like I said, mind map your presentation first with pen and paper, and that will help you and your brain figure out exactly what your big picture might be. When you know what your big picture is, find an image or some kind of visual that will help you tie everything together and place that onto your canvas, and try to put all of your content inside of that. Essentially what you're doing is you're putting up your own barriers, your own limitations on the amount of distance that you travel from one area to the next. Okay, and it will really help you in terms of designing your presentation. Everything will be much closer together, and also your audience, which is the most important thing, your audience is not going to have to travel huge distances when we move from one area to the next. Okay, now the very final tip I want to give you is when you actually come to building your prezis, there is a really logical way, I think, of putting them together. And one thing I come across quite a lot in our Prezi training sessions that we run is that people approach a Prezi design with a PowerPoint way of thinking. So they open the software and they just start throwing their content on, and then they try to organize it. Okay, and that's definitely a bad idea as well. What you don't want to do is approach Prezi with a PowerPoint hat on, because of course it's not PowerPoint, it's very, very different. PowerPoint has the limitations of just moving from slide to slide to slide. In Prezi, there are no slides. So if we throw everything on, it's very difficult to organize. But I always tell everyone that building a Prezi should be a piece of cake. So if we approach it in the same way, then we should be able to build things in a nice, logical, quite quick method of working. The very first thing we should add, so let's say the bottom layer of sponge for our Prezi cake, would be the background imagery. So for instance, my background image on this presentation that you're looking at now was actually just a very simple rectangle of blue colour, which is the flight safety card that you saw a second ago. That was the very first thing that I put onto this presentation, and that was just a JPEG image. Once I had that on the screen, I can then add the really tasty bits, so the cream and the jam, which is of course my content. So my text, my imagery, my video clips that you've seen, there could be audio narration, sound effects, anything at all in terms of content, I would consider as the cream and the jam, the really tasty bits of our Prezi cake. So get your background image on first, and then place the content within that background image. Okay, the very final thing you should then add would be your frames and your paths. So once all of your content is in the right place, go through the presentation and add your frames and add your path points. And the benefit of doing that is that you're not then concentrating solely on the content, you're focusing more on the flow of the presentation and what your audience is going to see, and of course the order in which they're going to see it. Now I would say that this way of working is in particularly really important for brand new Prezi users. Okay, you will find that you'll learn the software much quicker, you won't lose things on the canvas, And if you have a really good plan in place, actually the thing that should take the least amount of time is actually building the Prezi presentation. And that might sound kind of strange to some people, but trust me, I've been doing this for a long time, and actually what takes us the least time now is building the Prezi. We put more time into planning, getting our imagery, than we do actually putting the Prezi design together. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope you found that really useful. Please give me any feedback that you might have just below this video on YouTube. That would be great. You can also get in touch with us, of course, through thepresenter.com for any Prezi training and design requirements you might have. But really, just to summarize everything, the most important point here that I'm trying to make is always plan your Prezis. If you don't have a plan, if you don't know what your destination is, then you're probably going to deliver death by Prezi. Okay? Always know where you're going. Make sure you give your passengers a really, really smooth and comfortable flight. Use the big picture technique wherever you can. It's the most it's kind of the simplest way to present in Prezi, and it really helps your audience understand the journey that you're taking them on. And of course, beware of the no-fly zone as well. There are some very dangerous characters in that no-fly zone, and by having huge movements from one area to the next, we can make our audience feel quite motion sick with that, so please try to avoid it. Well, that's everything from me. I really hope you found that useful, and like I said, please feed back to us as much as you can. You can also follow us on Twitter as well, @thepresenter, and I really hope we end up working with you in the future. Take care.